hey, I know I've been in Australia 10 years and I'm raising my children here, but hey, my Asian brother, you and I are still part of the same tribe. We're still more alike than you think. So use that. Tap into the volume, the energy somebody speaks at. Speak to them like they speak to you. Point number 2 for building rapport. Speak to people about the things they like to speak about. Remember I mentioned the Eurovision, the song contest? Now that baffled me because my dad would rather talk about golf, he would have loved the win, and also about us kids. He didn't. Why would he be interested in a song contest? Yet every year he would make me stay up late European time with him and sit there as he cracked hot chestnuts into my hand. We would be waiting for the winner of this contest. And it's only as an adult that I realized the stakes for him were so high. He had to make sales to maintain his residency, and having content to connect with his clients with allowed him to make those sales. It would keep the hot chestnut in my hand, the rice bowl in my stomach, and the overpriced private school uniform on my back. So he did it. So speak to people like they speak to you, and talk to them about the things that they want to talk about. When you first meet a contact, put aside your desire to talk about the things you're interested in. Let them speak. The third thing that is really important was my father used his body. Now, I mentioned to you, he was pinned, severed at the waist by that countertop, like so many immigrant shopkeepers we've all seen, 7 days a week. He didn't get out much, but he made magic with his upper body. And why mirroring is really powerful is when we see somebody move their body the way we move our body, our brain goes, oh, they're like me. We're part of that same tribe. If they express the way that I express, well, we're alike. And that is so powerful in a hugely polarized world when people see themselves in you. So, the other reason mirroring is important is to do with trust. Now, trust is part of building connection. And what we know is the first thing that people do when they meet a stranger is they don't glance at their eyes or their mouth. They glance at their hands. Did you know that? Okay, well now we know. Communications expert Vanessa Van Edwards found out that the world's most watched TED Talks are the ones with the most hand gestures. And this is to do with the fact when we were back as tribespeople on that savannah, we were to come across a stranger from a foreign tribe. The first thing we would do would be they had their hands behind their back as possibly a weapon that could hurt us. It made us trust them less. If I was to do my whole speech to you right now with my hands behind my back, you wouldn't trust me as much. Your subconscious would be like, what is Simone hiding? So we want to build trust, and this is both for in-person and for on virtual. I even heard social media before. I use a lot of video for social media. Having your frame for any virtual conferencing that you have with a potential client in another city maybe, having it framed out and remembering my dad, that counter at the waist, make sure the bottom of your laptop screen touches the diaphragm. The diaphragm is the bit of triangular muscle in between your rib cage. Let's all find that right now. So your ribs are here and there's that little triangle of muscle. For the singers in here, yours is going to be stronger than the rest of us. That is where you should try and line up the bottom of the frame of your laptop so your hands are in shot. If they're under on your lap, it's the equivalent of standing on stage and doing that speech with your hands behind your back. So digital body language, in-person body language, and mirroring that client is really important. So if you were to meet and they look like they had a down day, body posture's not good, you wouldn't meet up with them and be like, hi, I'm here, how are you? It would show that you weren't resonant with where they're at and that you are not alike. We want to be alike, we want to match that body posture at first and then bring them out into good rapport. And naturally good human connectors do this innately, but it's something to be reminded of. So, rapport is our first pillar, and the 3 things are speak to people like they speak to you, talk to them about the things they like to speak about, and mirror their body language. The next pillar of human connection is commonalities connect. It's basically finding points of relatability between you and that person. So you've had rapport, tenderize the meat a little bit, and we're bringing you through the process now of getting closer and building even more trust. Now, finding commonalities, priming ourselves to look at how we are alike with people in a polarized world is so powerful. I have a book coming up which Chris mentioned, and in the book I feature a case study, a lady called Christina Sang, who I met when I was first living in Dubai. And Christina was the head of events at the Burj Khalifa, the Armani Hotel, the world's tallest hotel. And so she was dealing with like Arab royalty and Hollywood celebrities. Connection was literally her job. And I remember watching her one day and thinking, I have to find out this woman's story. So she was Korean in background, born and raised in Manila, did high school here in the US, hospitality school in Switzerland, where she met a Portuguese boyfriend, moved to Portugal with him, then went to Dubai where I met her, and she currently lives in Bali. And when she was living in Portugal, she went there, and like many foreign spouses, she didn't speak Portuguese, and after a while she got really, like, bored of her boyfriend's friends, which I think is totally relatable. And she decided, look, I have to make my own friends. So she went to a nightclub and she looked for the style of music, old school R&B. Who's an old school R&B fan? Oh my gosh, I'm so an old school R&B fan. Okay, so she knew already, commonality number one, everyone in this nightclub likes the same sort of music. She then went to the bathroom, she's touching up her makeup, listening for English speakers. She then went up to the English speakers and was like, oh, so we're all foreigners here in Lisbon. Do you like food? Who doesn't like food? Anyone here, raise your hand if you don't like food. Yeah, we're all part of the same tribe. We're all part of the same tribe. So that was the next commonality. And before she knew it, she had a group of friends in Lisbon and she felt less alone. For people like Christina and I who've spent a lot of time, and Chris as well, living in different countries, our brains subconsciously know, hey, I'm alone in this new country. I need a tribe to keep me safe. I need to go out and connect. And that's how Christina got so good at it, because she always had to make a group of friends as quickly as possible wherever she was. Truly, truly a master at it. Recently, it happened to me. Somebody used Commonalities Connect on me, and it was also in Portugal, which I heard you have a leading RE global event there coming up as well. So I was in Portugal in December, and there has not been many people who look like me as tourists in Europe for a couple of years now because of this thing called a pandemic. You might have heard of it. And so there was not many Asian tourists around. And we were at this castle in the center of Lisbon, and they had these narrow stairs. It was not like Game of Thrones where there's a wide stairs and Jon Snow is battling with people. It was really narrow, and only one set of people could go up and one set of people could go down at a time. And so there was a line of 10 Asian tourists coming up the stairs, and I stood to the side wearing my mask and my cap, so all you can see is my eyes. And I'm wearing a t-shirt with Bruce Lee's face on it. And the guy at the front of the line goes, oh, Bruce Lee. And because it's the year 2022 and we do not want to assume where people are from in the year 2022, I didn't know, he could be Japanese, he could be Korean, I didn't want to say anything. So I said, oh, you know Bruce Lee, you know him? And this guy said, yes, I am Chinese. And then, using what I mentioned earlier about rapport, I switched into Mandarin, which my Mandarin is terrible. Does anyone speak Mandarin in this crowd here today? Nice try, it's okay, it's okay. I appreciate the support. So I said to him in really bad Mandarin, you know, my father is Singaporean Chinese. And this whole line of tourists was like, oh, there was this communal moment where we were like, we are part of the same tribe, and we didn't even know it. And the last 2 years has been a bit rough for the East Asian community, so there was like a solidarity in that moment. And I realized if I or these people can walk through the world scanning for commonalities, how powerful and memorable that can make you. So it's as easy as this. If you're on a virtual conference call and the person is using a real background and not a virtual one, scan to see if there are any books on that bookshelf. Oh my God, you love Malcolm Gladwell? Love Malcolm Gladwell. My favorite book from his is Blink. If you are out and somebody is in a bar wearing the same sporting team that you love, wearing some of their kit, use that as that conversation opener. Condition yourself to have the commonalities connects mindset, scanning for how you are alike as opposed to different. So we've now done rapport, commonalities connect, and we're moving into the third pillar, and this is where you take connection from, and you've all, I'm sure, experienced this with your clients, that superficial transactional relationship, to that moment where your client actually asks you how you are and becomes your friend. Has anyone here had a client become a friend? Yeah, it's a beautiful thing. I've had a few coaching clients become that with me, and it's really nice. And that has to do with something that you might find really a little bit scary. It's to do with vulnerability. If I say vulnerability to you in a corporate context, do you find that a bit scary? Thought of being vulnerable? A few nods. I mean, it definitely, where I come from in Singapore, with the work culture there, that's absolutely petrifying to talk about being vulnerable. Vulnerability is any form of emotional disclosure. It's as easy as actually turning your video on video conference on as opposed to having it off. You're showing more emotional information for people to connect with. And I've had a really troubling relationship with vulnerability because I used to work in media. I was a radio DJ for 15 years. So every single month, like with a gun to my head, I had to disclose things about my life for entertainment value that I didn't necessarily want to. And what happened over the years was I would end up oversharing at dinner table parties and just thinking that that was normal because I was doing it 5 days a week for work. And what I can tell you for sure is vulnerability, this part of the 4 steps, before trust is established, is oversharing. So if we don't do rapport, commonalities connect, and we just go straight to vulnerability, it actually scares a potential client off more because it says to them, hey, I can't keep hold of my own secrets and my personal life, so I'm not going to be able to do that for you. And they become skeptical and they lack trust with you. So please use this powerful tool of vulnerability only after that trust is established. But once it is established, it's incredibly powerful. For me, it's the one tool that really takes us to authentic connection from something that might be a little bit more surface level. And I'm going to use 2 examples here, one from my part of the world and one from North America. So Singapore, this tiny, super clean red dot that I live on, was founded by a guy called Lee Kuan Yew. And he was a super stoic Chinese man, like really not much emotion at all. He spoke with a crisp British accent because he was Cambridge educated. And he was also, in Singaporean terms, kind of privileged because he was Chinese as opposed to the other races that make up the country. And one day in 1965, there was a national TV broadcast. And I want you to imagine it's black and white and the sound is kind of crackly, and he's sitting on a couch and he's exhausted. Because for the last few weeks he's been going back and forth with Malaysia. So Malaysia is our version of America and Singapore would be Canada. It's like Australia and New Zealand, if I can paint that picture for you. Our bigger neighbor. And they were trying to create a unified state. And at that moment, his self-confessed adult dream was dashed. Malaysia didn't want Singapore to be part of them. And he sits on this national broadcast and he bursts into tears. This was just unheard of. But what it did was incredibly powerful. In that moment, he ceased to be his race, his gender, his class. He was no longer this person that was, very educated in Singapore for those days. He was just a human being who had been devastated because he felt he had let people that he loved down. And every single person in the country can understand what that feels like. The human part of human connection is that vulnerability. It's genderless, it's ethnicless. An example on the North American front of this. Okay, raise your hand, you all know the Monica Lewinsky scandal, correct? I was a kid in the 90s watching this unfold on Australian television, and you know, I think there was such little understanding of her side of what had happened. And for years, there was no emotional disclosure from her. We never heard her side of the story, and she was, you know, painted as this kind of woman. And years later, decades later, she gets on the TED stage, and she says she had to shower with the door open because her mother feared she would take her life. In that moment, we get to see the full picture of what it would be like to start your career in your 20s and possibly have no future because of a scandal like that that's global. Your dating life is basically destroyed because everything is public. And how do you go on? When we didn't have the vulnerability of her side of the story, we had no idea, we couldn't relate. She was this thing. And then once we knew, we thought to ourselves, how many of us would have been any different to have our names dragged through the mud like that as our lives were just beginning? So vulnerability, what an absolute gift it is. And in the context of the work you do, it can be as simple as one day when one of your clients, who there is good trust and rapport with, asks you, how's your day going? And being open to giving the true answer. Oh, sales are really, really good right now, but to be honest, having a bit of an issue with my husband. Kids are playing up. Oh, my kid has to go to a specialist. They think he might have ADHD. It's as small as that, and I tell you, if that rapport and that trust is established, that client will reciprocate. More on reciprocity in just a moment. But to recap again, we've had rapport, commonalities connect, and then we've had vulnerability, and our very last of the 4 pillars that takes you to the highest level of fulfillment. Because human connection, it's not just about performing at work, it's not just about physical and mental well-being, it's what we need to feel fulfilled. The next component is service, being of service. I want to hop in the time machine with you, and I want to go back to that savannah. For us, the worst thing would be to be rejected from that tribe. We would have been susceptible to threats, we would probably have been killed off. To this day, as digitized as we are, and virtually connected, that cave person brain still sits in our heads, and it seeks out connection, and it detects social rejection the same way we feel physical pain. And there are studies to back this up. That's why a broken heart, you can feel that pain in your chest. So what better way to prevent yourself from being kicked out of the tribe than to be indispensable to the tribe? Now, the tribe could be leading RE. It could be your particular organization. It could be your extended family or your community that you live in, your suburb. If you positively impact that tribe, not only do you feel really good, and we all know this, any of us who've ever, been part of any sort of organized religion know this, doing good for others feels really, really good, but it also allows us to feel better in our mental health because we feel more socially connected. It also does great things for the person receiving the aid because they feel they're not lost and not acknowledged by the tribe as well. So one of the women in my book that I've interviewed is a lady called Shelley Tagilsky, and she's a CNN hero. And during the pandemic, she set up a mutual aid community called Pandemic of Love. And what Pandemic of Love does, they don't work like a normal charity, they're just the middleman, and they directly connect the person who is giving the aid, a Walmart card, a car, money, whatever it is, to the exact person who needs that aid. And so those people are put into contact, they see each other. It's not just a blind, you give money and you never hear from the person ever again. And what she found was, not only was the donor feeling incredibly good during a time of huge adversity, which was the pandemic, also the donor was able to feel much more socially connected as well. So my question or my action point here really is, have a think right now. When was the last time you gave of your time, no strings attached, to something beyond your family, your direct family? And how could you do it if you haven't? And I would love for you to make this an action point for the next week after the conference. It could be maybe even someone you meet today, new to the industry, who wants mentorship, and you give that time for free. The gifts are incredible. We need to feel we belong to that tribe, and the loneliness and disconnection we're seeing globally as an epidemic is to do with the fact that we live right now in these like digital silos. In my part of the world, we're still socially distant, which means every connection is contrived. We're controlling every time we meet or see someone. You have the pleasure here of being wonderfully open in North America, and I wonder if you can take that into account and put that into your diary. So, to wrap up the 4 pillars, rapport, that's when other people perceive us to be more like them. Number 2, commonalities connect, living with a mindset of points of relatability, scanning for that in a polarized world. Number 3, vulnerability, putting the human in human connection. And number 4, being of service, living with an others-driven mindset in a self-driven world. If you do all these things, you're going to be not only better in your own mental and physical health, but you're going to be much more memorable to those clients. I know you're all already super top achievers as it is, but super top achievers, I know with type A personalities, you also just want to be getting better all the time. And human connection could be that missing piece. The very final 3 points I want to leave you with today is also through a story. We've talked a lot about Dad the shopkeeper. I want to talk to you now about my mum. My mum was a teacher at Singapore's most elite girls' school, and the country has an education system not to be laughed at. They take education very seriously where I come from. And so she had a role in mentoring some of the nation's most vibrant, dynamic female minds. Women who are now CFOs, they are engineers who built our subway system. And when I first started speaking back in 2018, the very first paid gig I ever got was for International Women's Day. So this is kind of like an Oprah full circle moment because IWD is tomorrow. And they wanted me to showcase leading women. And I was in radio. I didn't know any corporate women. So I called my mum up. And she's sitting there in her wheelchair in the nursing home in Australia. She's holding the phone with her remaining good hand. And I said, Mama, can I have the name of the woman who's the CFO of that big bank? I want to do some research. And she pauses. And she says, Simone, I am just so proud of them. And I was like, Mum, I'm glad you're proud, but I need names for my speech. So what about the woman who is a surgeon, saved people's lives? And she pauses, this time for a little bit longer. She says, Simone, I'm so proud of them. At this point, I'm getting sassy. So I'm like, I'm really glad you're proud, Mum, but I really need names for my speech. What about the woman who's the engineer and helped build our subway, our MRT? And this time, my mother pauses for an inordinate amount of time until I realize that she's ashamed because she cannot remember their names. And this is one of the big takeaways that I want to leave you with on human connection. Yes, it's really important that you make great money. It's really important that you have an abundant life. But on human connection terms, those worldly achievements, they don't mean that much at all. It's like what Maya Angelou says, it's all about how you made people feel. The experience of mentoring and teaching those girls filled my mum with unforgettable pride, set her on fire. And it was reciprocal, because 40 years later, those same busy women, pre-pandemic, would fly on their annual leave thousands of kilometres to visit her in that nursing home in Australia. I mean, I don't even remember my high school teacher's name. So the fact that they were also profoundly touched by how she made them feel was incredible. So it's all about how you make people feel. Number two, reciprocity. How do we know if a connection becomes authentic? Well, it won't be you chasing one way all the time. It was that feeling of reciprocity that she never forgot them, but they never forgot her. So look for reciprocity if you're ever doubting a connection in your life. It doesn't feel right. And lastly, yes, human connection, it's vital to your work. Human connection is so important to that physical and mental health. I'll say it again. But human connection is your legacy. It's how you will be remembered at the end of your life. And I know this because 10 years after that story that I mentioned at the beginning with my dad, 10 years later, the beads of gravel unfurled around the tires of another vehicle into that shopping centre car park. And it was the hearse on the morning of my dad's funeral. Because Dad worked all the time, Mum thought, oh, good idea, we should follow his daily route from the house to the office and then to the church. And I looked up with my pimply 19-year-old face against the window of the car, and there was his Malaysian customer, his German customer, and his British customer, all coming to pay tribute to the man that was their local shopkeeper. Human connection, it's your legacy. It's how you'll be remembered. I'm Simone Heng. I collect stories of human connection. If you have any, feel free to write to me. Let's connect.
Stay honest. Have a look.
A little bit of background and context. I call myself a systems thinker, which means I tend to think of events as linked in cycles as opposed to simple linear cause and effect. Thinking systems started for me as a child. You see, I had severe ADD as a child, although I didn't know it at the time. It wasn't invented yet. Nobody knew the term ADD. I thought I was just forgetful, very forgetful. So I found I had to invent an array of systems so I could get through my daily routines. Little sayings or phrases or rhymes or jingles. So I wouldn't forget to put on some article of clothing in the morning. I wouldn't leave the house without my socks and my underwear. Another set of systems to make sure I wouldn't forget daily tasks like combing my hair or brushing my teeth.
Come again.
Have you ever had this nightmare? For me, it's a nightmare. But you're sitting in school, you're at your desk, and all of a sudden you look down and realize you're not wearing any pants. I know there are other people that have that. I mean, it sounds like a silly dream, I'm sure. But for someone with severe forgetfulness, it's a very real fear.
Honest
I'm actually very
prices.
thankful for my age. It's changed my perceptions of the world. I'm going to talk today about the economy and poverty as systems and how they're interrelated. And I'm not sure I would have seen the world that way if I hadn't spent my lifetime trying to invent systems to compensate for my own forgetfulness. I came to Alabama in 1994 after living in Germany for about 12 years. I was part of a German engineering group that was sent to build the Mercedes-Benz plant not far. I was actually the first Mercedes-Benz employee on a site that now has thousands of them. You wouldn't recognize today what I saw then. Just a couple trailers and factories. What they were trying to do at that time, they were trying to create a flat spot so we could actually build the plant. Because remember before that, it looked like this. If they had snow in Alabama, you could ski where they currently have a Mercedes-Benz plant. But I remember calling my mother. I was excited I was moving from Germany back to Alabama, and I shared that with her. She lives in California. And her first words were, "Oh, Jim, I'm so glad you're coming home." And I had to laugh. I said, "Mom, that's really funny. You know, there's still going to be 2,000 miles between us." But still, I was coming back to America. Perception is reality, and for her and me both, it is home. America leads the world in a lot of statistics. One of them, unfortunately, is poverty. I never saw poverty during my time in Germany or my life in sheltered Southern California. I never experienced poverty firsthand until I came to Alabama. But the truth is, you don't have to travel far from Tuscaloosa to find entire counties with poverty levels above 30%. It caused me to wonder, why is our system so much different than what I had experienced in Europe? Why does our system tolerate chronic poverty? You know, there are more people in poverty today in America than there were in 1964 when Lyndon Johnson launched his war on poverty. Why was a high rate of poverty not okay in 1964, but seemingly okay today? In systems theory, which is the study of systems, one characteristic of a flawed system is that it tolerates errors. And it makes me wonder, is chronic poverty an error that we've learned to tolerate? Is our economic system flawed? You know, poverty itself can be characterized as a system. There's a cycle of poverty that has trapped Alabama families, actually entire communities for generations. It goes like this. You start with no money, which leads to no education, which then leads to no jobs, which then leads to no money. And the cycle repeats itself. It's a self-reinforcing cycle. It causes a death spiral. It's difficult to escape. What we know, again, from systems theory about self-reinforcing cycles is that if you can reverse any element in the cycle, the entire cycle reverses direction. It actually starts to propel itself upwards instead of down. According to the 2012 census estimates, the poorest county in America is Wilcox County, Alabama. It's the county with the lowest median income. Are you familiar with it? It's not far from Selma, a little bit south of Selma. Wilcox County is home to a very small community called Rehoboth. And Rehoboth is where the Freedom Quilting Bee was founded. Have you ever heard of the Freedom Quilting Bee? It's a terrific story. My wife shared this story with me, and I was fascinated reading about it. In 1966, in the middle of the civil rights movement, an Episcopal priest, a civil rights worker named Francis Walter, got lost driving in Wilcox County. And he came upon a clothesline with 3 quilts in it. And these quilts had bold primary colors, unlike anything he'd ever seen. Now, because his church was in New Jersey, he was familiar with the op art movement that was popular in New York City at the time. And the op art movement focused on geometric patterns and shapes. And he saw these quilts and knew that they would fit in, they had something. So he stopped his car, got out and approached the house.
Made a profit?
And the quilter, a woman named Ora McDaniels, was so frightened to see somebody approaching the house that she took off running into the woods. So much for first encounters. But he did eventually convince Ora and others that they could make good money for their quilts if they could pool their efforts and sell them into markets in the Northeast. So 60 women formed the Freedom Quilting Bee on March 26th of 1966. They elected their first president,
See you later.
Estelle Witherspoon. It was formed as a cooperative, and soon after that, their quilts were sold at auction in New York City, and they were a huge hit. These women started making money, good money, for the first time in their lives. They fixed roofs, they installed indoor plumbing, they bought washers and dryers, they sent children to college. They actually got purchase contracts from stores like Sears and Bloomingdale's. They spurred what turned out to be a nationwide revival in quilting and inspired what the New York Times art critic Michael Kimmelman called some of the most magical modern art America has produced. Their quilts were even displayed in the Smithsonian. I was very fortunate to meet Muhammad Yunus at a conference on
I have lots to
social
show.
business. I'm familiar with Muhammad Yunus. You might have heard of him. He's a Nobel Prize laureate and the father of microlending. And he had this to say about poverty. Poverty was created
Stay
not by
on
poor
this.
people, but by their circumstances. Change their circumstances, and poverty disappears quickly. The women of the Freedom Quilting Bee were able to change their circumstances and reverse that cycle of poverty. But as wonderful as the story is, it strikes me with another question. Why doesn't this happen more often? How come we haven't heard more stories like the Freedom Quilting Bee? I first became interested in addressing poverty while I was doing a project for a just-in-time supplier to Mercedes-Benz. This company had an army of workers who were sequencing parts in the Mercedes-Benz. It's an important job because remember, it's part of a much larger system. So any part out of sequence could break the system. You can actually shut down the Mercedes-Benz production line. I met some of the most wonderful people I've ever met in my life on that plant floor. Magical, hardworking, dedicated, inspiring employees who made their company successful. And most of them were one flat tire away from bankruptcy. You see, at that time, this very important job paid only $7 an hour. $8 if you had seniority. Most of the people on that plant floor were not making a living. They belonged to a group that come to be called the working poor. Here's a surprising statistic about poverty. 60% of families in poverty actually have a family member who's working. And the majority of them are actually working full-time. So I ask you, why on earth can't somebody with a full-time job make enough money to lift themselves and their families out of poverty? Is the system broken? Is there an underlying systems problem? And more importantly, can we find a system solution? Capitalism has been called the greatest economic system on the planet, and no doubt it's fueled the engine of progress in the industrialized world for more than a century. But the only prerequisite to participation in capitalism is what? Having capital, which oddly excludes most would-be participants. It doesn't. 2 core requirements for starting and running a business are capital. In other words, money and work. Usually ownership is given in exchange for money. But why? Why is that? If you don't have money, will you never enjoy the benefits of ownership? Why not give ownership in exchange for work? It's just as important, it's just as critical to a business as well. I mean, you can't run a business without work. The good news is, there is a form of business that provides ownership in exchange for work. It's called a worker-owned cooperative. It's a business entity that's owned and controlled by its workers. Decisions are made democratically, usually one person, one vote. I'm proposing worker-owned cooperatives as a pathway to business ownership and a pathway out of poverty. Worker-owned cooperatives, they build individual wealth and they stabilize communities by anchoring ownership. You see, a co-op business isn't going to close up and relocate someplace else to find lower wages. They're not going to move production overseas to increase shareholder value. Where the focus of a traditional company is on shareholder value, the whole focus of a worker-owned cooperative is on job security, people over profits. As a startup, a worker-owned cooperative is 3 times more likely to be successful than their non-cooperative counterparts, and they're more productive. One London School of Business study compared co-ops to non-co-ops in the same industry and found productivity increases between 9 and 19% across the board. Co-ops have transformed the economies of large parts of northern Spain, northern Italy, France, Quebec, Canada. But they're not new to America. It's not a new business form in America. 80% of our milk comes from dairy cooperatives. 30% of farm equipment comes from farm cooperatives. Do you know that 75% of the U.S. land mass is powered by rural electric cooperatives? Surprising. There are 30,000 co-op businesses in the U.S. with over $3 trillion in assets and $652 billion in revenue. But most of those are consumer or producer cooperatives, where the workers are not owners. A worker-owned cooperative, on the other hand, is still relatively rare in America. So why do you think that is? Why are they so rare? I mean, with a clear path to ownership, the ability to reverse the cycle of poverty, the documented community and business benefits, why don't we see more worker-owned cooperatives? It's what I would call a no-brainer. My daughter is older now. When she was 15, she would have said, duh. I'll give you a few reasons. First reason is they're complicated. It's a lot more complex starting a worker-owned cooperative than it is to start a sole proprietorship or even an LLC. Besides the usual business formalities, you've got to create, document, and then manage a system for sharing ownership. And the laws that govern co-op, they're different from state to state. Some states prescribe exactly what kind of co-op or corporation you need, depending upon the type of co-op. Other states, you're not allowed to incorporate into a co-op. So it takes a lot of research at the state level. The second reason is that there isn't an ecosystem, or very little ecosystem, to support cooperatives. There are very few service providers like attorneys or accountants that understand anything about cooperatives, especially worker-owned cooperatives. So unless you happen to find that rare attorney that knows something about cooperative, you end up doing most of the work yourself, or training your attorney to do the work. The next reason, I hear this often from people, and I like to call it the skills argument. The skills argument goes something like this. If a lack of education was part of that cycle of poverty that you're talking about, then people in poverty don't have the skills required to be productive in the work environment. Isn't that right? You think that's right? The answer is no, it's not right. Profoundly wrong. It's because of another kind of system, production system. Production systems have revolutionized manufacturing and a lot of other industries through continuous improvement. But besides these terrific productivity gains, production systems have a very important feature to improving employee skills, and that's standardized work. Documented work standards is the basis of any good production system. It enables any employee at any skill level to become quickly productive at a given task by following the standard. Then once they've mastered that task, they can start contributing to continuous improvement. So production systems with standardized work negates that argument, that skills argument against cooperative formation. But by far, the biggest reason we don't see more cooperatives is simply knowledge, or really the lack thereof. I see worker-owned cooperatives as a systems solution to the problem of poverty, making our system of capitalism more inclusive. But the best solution in the world is of no value if you don't know about it, which is why I'm here today.
Have a look.
I'm telling you about it. So now you know. John F. Kennedy, in his inaugural address in 1961, said that if a free society cannot help the many who are poor, it cannot save the few who are rich. Worker-owned cooperatives may well expand our system of capitalism to include and help the many who are poor. I, for one, think that's an idea worth sharing.
In a recent family conversation, I said that I would raise my hippies. And my mom said, I object, we were not hippies. So I asked her why not. And her reply was, because we had jobs. This is a picture of me and my dad on the plaza in downtown Decatur, California in 1979. You may recall. But despite appearances, my parents were not out selling food, chasing the Grateful Dead in the streets. They were pioneers in the cooperative movement, imagining and creating new ways to expand ways that don't exploit human labor or natural resources. During my childhood, we were part of a childhood cooperative. So parents and our friend group didn't have to compete for childhood. Instead, one parent would take the lead, while the others let them work, and they coordinated their schedules. It didn't just save money, it also built a strong sense of community. Now, when we go grocery shopping in the community, it's a big store with employees who order food.
My pleasure.
But I remember the huge tomatoes at the National Food Company, because that's where I'd hang out while my mom stocked the shelves and worked at the cashiers, not as an employee, but as a member owner who didn't work for money, but for the convenient economic benefit of wholesale food prices. That was not hippie. It was strong economic policy at the grassroots level. I'm going to explain why. The employer-employee model of new business is one of the driving forces behind it, and how cooperatives can easily replace exploitation with regeneration. We say that we abolished slavery long ago, but you may have seen us do that. This is chocolate production. But what about the fact that right now, billions of people on Earth are stuck in insurmountable poverty, working long hours for payment that doesn't meet their basic human needs, while their employers get rich? What is that called if it's not called slavery? Maybe it has another name. And what about freedom from tyranny? The story goes that the colonies fought a revolutionary war, developed our democracy, and now we self-govern. Of the people, by the people, for the people. Yet every day, employees are subjected to the tyranny of employers who have the power to dictate their actions, to take the value of their labor as their own, and cast them out on the street jobless if they don't perform well for their profits. That is certainly not democracy. what is it called if it's not called tyranny? Maybe it has another name. We measure the success of business and the health of the economy based on growth. If it's growing, it's doing well. And yet we all know that to grow our businesses and expand our so-called healthy economies, we must exploit our natural resources, further driving catastrophic climate change, mass extinction, and the genocide of indigenous people. We can't call this a successful business plan for healthy economies. It's got to be called something else. And it does have a name. It's called capitalism. Capitalism is the driving force behind global climate change. And what's really interesting is that with just a small shift in the way that we organize business, we can combat global climate change and the exploitation of people without getting rid of the community in the first place. In a capitalist system like ours, business owners whose profits depend on low possible are naturally incentivized to pay their employees as little as possible and to pay as little as possible to superiors so that they, the owners, can take home more. That's capitalism. It is every successful business has made their research. It is quite literally business as usual. Now, I can imagine that there are business owners out there right now saying things like, I care for my employees, I treat them like family, and I pay them as much as possible. That is wonderful. So what would happen if your employees became owners and they had the power to set their own wages and the power to decide the direction of the business system? What if you became their agent and businesses made decisions for them? What if profits were distributed equitably to everyone who works there? Virginie Terrebonne, who's a professor of economics at Leeds University Business School and was a senior research economist at the International Labor Office in Geneva, has an answer to those questions. She says solid, consistent evidence across countries, systems, and time periods shows that worker cooperatives are at least as productive as conventional ones, and more productive in some areas. The more participatory cooperatives are, the more productive they tend to be. But the productivity of worker-owned cooperatives is not what I'm here to talk about. I'm here to show you that small local movements that help existing businesses become worker-owned and help new worker-owned businesses start are a key, a fundamental key to environmental and social justice. In the midst of this growing ecological and social catastrophe, we know that we must seek radical new ways to reduce carbon emissions and build a just and stable society. Yet many people watching this TEDx talk right now have never considered the possibility that employer-employee small doing businesses is one of the root causes of the problem. And that's why worker-owned cooperatives are instead of private ownership.
For the king,
In a worker-owned cooperative, there's shared ownership.
we never
Shared responsibility, shared reward. In that environment, we make different choices. We think about the consequences of our actions. Instead of marketing basic human needs to the highest bidder, cooperatives around the world are creating just and equitable utilities, food supply chains, and waste management. Instead of maximizing by paying as little as possible for labor and resources, cooperatives distribute as two the existing global cooperative economy has more than 1 billion members. It generates equitable income for 10% of the United States. Small cooperatives Cooperation Humble, a community health worker program, is designed to create cooperative jobs for the chronically underserved members of our community. And right now, locally produced grains become worker-owned, while simultaneously helping local farmers envision farming cooperatives to supply the market. These connections are essential to our they remind me of associates like my family states back in the day when my not happy elementary school teacher, in addition to teaching me how to read, also taught me became fundamental to my self-esteem. And it turns out it's fundamental to the cooperative as well. This means that I'm the boss of my own destiny. We would just say I am the boss of my own body. Lead me to do it my own way. Because leading your own body is hard. In an environment of cooperation and mutual aid, I have to stand up for my own freedom to choose. I ensure everyone succeeds about business by looking at the root meaning of the word conflict, which is care for one another. How we care for our own will determine the future, not only of the human race, but of all others that are yet to be born in generations to come. This is not merely a concept. This is a policy. By supporting local workers and jobs, we distribution and extraction with regeneration, freedom, and care.
1.62 said, yes, of course there is. It's Kant's theory of aesthetics. Today, we don't have ratio, we don't have body. We have people and places. We have atoms. And the atoms formula, the first variable is always nominal. This is scientific fact. We actually went through studies all the words we could possibly find and all the advertisements that were out there. And the most common word, all of those ads, was buy now, risk free warning. In a cult of knowledge. Companies want us to like new things, to buy new things, to crave new things. Is that we don't listen. According to the mere exposure effect, one of the oldest and most robust theories of positive psychology, the mere exposure of a stimulus to you over time will bias you toward that stimulus. In English, familiarity is good. And indeed, when you think about it, you seek out new songs. Songs you most reliably enjoy are those with familiar chord structures and symbols. We seek out new movies. In every year of this century, a majority of the population in America has adaptations to familiar stories. In fact, maybe the best proof of the power of familiarity is that thing that is so familiar to you, your own face. Turns out, people prefer the face they see in mirrors to the face they see in photos. Maybe you have a friend who complains constantly about how he or she looks in Facebook photos and is often constantly admiring images of themselves in real life. Well, this is not pure vanity. This is mere exposure effect. The face is slightly asymmetrical. The versions you see a reflection versus a photo. And if you're not a celebrity, then the version you're most used to seeing is not in a photograph, but rather in the most common reflection the world sees. Consider that version of your face not because it's you at your most beautiful, but because it's you at your most familiar. In fact, our familiarity seems so deep that people think it might be tinged too hard genetically. The evolutionary theory for the preference for the familiar is that if you're a hunter-gatherer and you're trawling the savanna of Africa and you see a plant or an animal and you recognize it, that's a very good sign that plant or animal has been familiar to you. So, of course, you should prefer it. But this creates an enormous problem. Without people only like new things if they're just like old things. So the question before us today is, how do you balance in such a way as to design I want to tell you a story about a man who and also a man that I would imagine 90 to 95% of this room would not know. Raymond Loewy. He designed 20th. Raymond Loewy was a French orphan who came over to the United States after World War I. And his brother picked him up in a cab. In the 1920s, they drive down to downtown Manhattan. One of the tallest buildings down there is the Equitable Building. And Raymond Loewy takes the elevator to the top of this building, and he looks out over Manhattan from this vista. And he's expecting from his dream to see a world that is round, that is feminine. The New York that unfurls in front of him is the exact opposite. It's grungy, it's noisy, and Loewy looks upon himself and his brother and says, I'm going to devote the rest of my life. And Loewy did so. Loewy designed the most famous car of the 20th century, 1950 Studebaker. Designed the most famous train and locomotive of the 20th century, designed the modern Greyhound bus, the modern tractor, the modern Coca-Cola fountain, designed that pencil sharpener that looks like an egg with a little spindle coming out of it that you've seen in 100,000 classrooms. He designed the logos for Exxon and US Steel. He basically designed all of 1950. In fact, one day, Raymond Loewy was hanging out with his friend, and he saw the president's plane take off, and he said, so President Kennedy invited Loewy to the Oval Office, where they sat on the floor and cut little papers until they achieved the perfect design of their platform. In fact, the design that Raymond Loewy came up with there on the floor of the Oval Office still plane in the world. What did this man possibly understand about human psychology? He knew what he wanted from planes and trains and cars. This man was like John Clinton Steve Jobs. He understood everything. Fortunately for us, Raymond Loewy mind. Why? Raymond Loewy said, on one hand, there is neo-philia, a love of new things, and an appreciation for the new, a need to discover. But on the other hand, there is neophobia, fear of anything that is too new, and a need to preserve it. And Loewy said that in order to do this, you need to make products that are right and to sell something familiar, you have to make it surprising. But to sell something surprising, you have to make it familiar. Now, Loewy was not a scientist, but this theory has been proved and validated by scores of studies and meta-studies since he died. It has been used to explain hits in technology, in academics, in culture, and even in politics. Let's start with technology. something new and then make that new thing popular with an audience that doesn't care. This is the problem recently at Spotify. Spotify obviously which was developing this app that many people in the audience have used called Discover Weekly. If you haven't used Discover Weekly, every single Monday, Spotify will dump 30 songs onto your phone. And initially, they wanted those 30 songs to be entirely new, that people never heard the song and they had never heard the artist. But when they were initially testing it, the flaws in the algorithm accidentally let slip through some familiar songs and some familiar artists. So they quickly fixed the bug and they kept going. But what happened is that when they kept testing the app once they fixed the bug, engagement with the app plummeted. It turned out that having just a little bit of familiarity in this discovery platform fell that which was surviving. They had to make it. I'd imagine that most academics don't think of themselves typically. They think of themselves as operating in the market. In order to more discipline, you often need to be published by the most famous publishers. And therefore, you are essentially giving up your research, proposing your research to people who are Harvard University, one of the figure out what was the formula for a hit. They wanted to figure out what sort of hit was most likely to be accepted by the NIH. Was it really, really novel and crazy? Or was it extremely familiar? So they created a dummy list of 100 different hits, and they coded each of them with a novel. And then they delivered those papers to 100 different researchers who scored their papers. And the graph of that scoring looks a bit like an upside-down map. So over here, you have most familiar. Over here, you have most novel. It turns out that researchers without they prefer that which they call popular. Yep. Mine. Three. Identity. As I looked at nature, I spent a long time trying to figure out this issue of why do fashions exist. Indeed, if the brain is an organ of ancient chemistry, then why should we change our opinion of what is good? But of course we do. Guitar solos are weird in the 1930s, extremely popular in the 1970s, and then weird again in the 2000s. Skinny jeans are unpopular and then popular and unpopular and popular, and they follow the sign curve. So why does this happen? Well, it's really important to understand that for the vast majority of human history, fashions really didn't exist. People wore the same clothes for millennia. You never heard of people wearing togas if they should somehow change the look of their toga from one to the other. But a really interesting way to look at that is to say, all right, well, let's say we have different clothing and fashion preferences. But let's imagine a make-believe store. And at the store, all the clothes are made of the same. They all cost the same price. And there is no marketing. It's important to think about this in your head because as an economic writer, I often think, all right, well, to explain fashion, I would think that it must be constrained by price, or by the fact that JC doesn't want you to wear a certain kind of pant anymore, so they take it away. Or they want you to wear a new kind of pant. But imagine if you live in a massive store where all of the clothes exist and they're all the same price and the marketing is that store exists here in the real world. It is the marketplace of first names. Think about it. All first names exist. They all cost the same price, and there's no direct marketing. Nike really, really wants you to buy its next shoe, but there's no advertisement in Nike history that has ever said, oh, after you buy your shoe, would you please name your baby girl after the Greek goddess of victory and speed? It's never happened. So why do first names follow the same hype cycle as clothes? So a sociologist named Stanley Leverson investigated this, and he came up with a really interesting theory that essentially just went right back to tend to prefer names that are familiar to tribes. So take a name like Samantha. Samantha in the 1980s was not a particularly popular name. It was about the 30th most popular baby girl
Honest
name in the
prices.
country. But just enough young couples decided that that was a perfectly popular name for their baby girl. That in 1992, 222,000 couples named their baby girl Samantha,
Made a profit?
making it the second most popular baby girl name of that year. Then think about what happened 5 years later. All these little Samanthas go into kindergarten together, and the kindergarten is suddenly just run amok with Samantha, 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 when all of these parents thought they were giving their daughter unique names. And so since most parents have a preference for names that are familiar but also surprising, the name Samantha naturally, without any organization, rises in popularity and then falls. One of the more interesting clues for the fact that parents have a specific taste for popularity is that siblings tend to have similarly common or uncommon names. And this is intuitively true. If you
Buying
meet
or
the
selling?
siblings, Michael, Emily, and Sarah, it's a little bit strange if they say,
Come
this is our
again.
sister, Xanthopy. But if you meet the siblings Xanthopy, Prairie Rose, Esmeralda, it's very strange if they're like, also, here's our brother Chad. Parents have a specific taste for familiarity. One of the most interesting proofs of this naming theory is looking at the phenomenon of baby girl names for Black Americans. For the vast majority of human history, for American history, blacks and whites had similar names. But starting in about the 1960s, there was a great portent where some names began to sound white and other names sounded black. And one of those markers for a black name is the L-A-L-E prefix, like for LeBron James or LaDainian Thomas. But this was basically unheard of before the 1960s. But Stanley Lieberson found that starting in 1967, 8 distinct
I have lots to trade.
black baby girl names peaked in popularity with a La prefix. And they peaked in the following:
Got everything?
Latonia, Latanya, Latasha, Latoya, Latrice, Lakeisha, Latisha, Latricia. And what's so fascinating about the sequence is just how orderly it is. Every next popular name is a play on what came before it. It takes the familiar and it makes it surprising. Fourth, politics. In this age of hyper-partisanship and polarization, there is an enormous demand to figure out how people can talk to each other, how we can persuade each other. But often when we get into debates, when we get into discussions, we try to persuade someone of our point of view, we begin with our code of ethics. So if you're a liberal, you'll say you shouldn't like Donald Trump because his policies are cruel.
Welcome, friend.
Or if you're a conservative, you might say you shouldn't like Bernie Sanders because he's trying to turn us into Democrats. Now, on its face, these statements are perfectly genuine and sincere, but they fail immediately as articles of persuasion. Because if you're a conservative who supports Trump, you probably like those policies that are discriminatory. And if you're the liberal supporting Bernie Sanders, you kind of want to nudge the U.S. toward Denmark. But imagine if instead we invert the process and we begin with the code of ethics
See you
of the
later.
person that we're talking about. We piggyback off of their familiarity. So if
Wanna
you're talking
trade?
to someone as a liberal, and you're talking to someone who supports Donald Trump, you might say, one of the things that I've always respected about the Republican Party is their emphasis on patriotism, putting country over self, and seeking service. Help me think through times in Donald Trump's business career he's been a paragon of these values.
Stay honest.
Now, you might not create a Bernie Sanders supporter on the spot. You might be slapped for insouciance. You're going to get a lot farther following this path than you are putting forth first principles that the person you're speaking to disagrees with. The model that I've just proposed is called the moral foundations theory. And it says essentially that it's always more beneficial when debating with somebody else to begin with their first principles, to to begin with their code of ethics and then show how slow walking those code of ethics toward the center might make their position leak into your position. All debate involves a form of ideological advertising. And in both polemics and in products, to make it Maya, make it familiar. The last story I want to tell takes us back to Raymond Loewy. And it takes us back to his last assignment as an industrial designer. Raymond Loewy was told to design the interior habitat for the first NASA space orbital, the most surprising and unfamiliar and exotic environment you could possibly imagine a human being in deep space. And Loewy conducted a bunch of habitability studies, and he made some tweaks here and some tweaks there, but his most famous contribution to space history is that he cut a hole in the side of the NASA space orbital. He placed a sheet of glass there and created a viewing portal for Earth. Yes, that viewing portal that you have seen in all of those movies, that too was Raymond Loewy's innovation. And I cannot think of a more perfect illustration of Maya or a more beautiful inspiration to creators everywhere. Because it says that a window to a new world can also show you. Thank you.
So Maya is just such an interesting concept with so many applications. I'm wondering, do you think that there are ways to apply this idea to help people from diverse backgrounds better relate to each other?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the ideas that comes up in developmental psychology is this issue of sensitive periods. That people develop their particular familiarity during specific periods in their life, which tends to be relatively young. People tend not to change their taste in music or their taste in food after the age of 40 or 50. So when thinking about this question of justice, it's important sometimes to not only focus on adults, not only trying to remediate adults, but also realizing that the way to get liberal-minded people, the way to get people who think multiculturally and embrace those of all stripes and colors and creeds is actually to have a kind of cradle-to-grave strategy. Where you say we should build neighborhoods. We should focus on neighborhoods and build neighborhoods where you have a combination of ideologies and colors and creeds and all of this. So I think sometimes we think of justice as purely remedial, and of course there's lots of people doing very important work there, but it's also so important that we think about taste formation, even on important issues like politics, as being a project that involves the neighborhood.
Absolutely, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good day, everyone. My name is Bernhard. I'm from Vienna, and I grew up in the 70s and 80s in a very safe and family-centered environment. Discussing with my parents about society, values, and politics was a normal thing when I was young. But less from the perspective of political parties, but more about the importance of individual freedom, social engagement, and about how important values are in life to make society a better place. By the way, this is me, 1973, explaining the world to the governor of the state of Austria.
For those are often consumer owned, are also experts in fields of co-op governance, decision making, onboarding process.
My job is to do something bizarre, if you think about it. I have to talk to you today about really the history of socialism, where it's been and where it's going. And I'm reminded of a certain sad poem that Dylan Thomas used to recite as he traveled across the United States. He was going from one club to another, people interested in poetry, explaining, as he put it, the death of a movement inside poetry to a group of people who hadn't known it was born. And that was difficult for him. So I'm talking to you about socialism here in the United States, where we are now emerging, rather like a hibernating bear, from 50 years of repression in which socialism was neither taught, nor discussed, nor analyzed, nor appreciated, nor dealt with as if it were really there. It was swept under the rug if you were lucky, and it was demonized if you weren't, with demonization being the major form. And let me be real personal about it. Even though I come from humble backgrounds, for a lot of peculiar reasons, I went to the elite schools here in the United States. So my undergraduate time was spent at Harvard, and then I went to Stanford for my master's degree, and then I got my PhD at Yale. As you can see, I'm kind of a poster boy for elite education. And there I studied economics, history and economics. And in those three institutions, when I was going through them, I was never required to read one word of critical economic analysis, say by, I'll pick a minor author, Karl Marx, in order to understand, that was a joke, by the way, just there, in order to understand the capitalist system. My teachers were pretending they were analyzing for me. That's an amazing statement, and it tells you something about what we are emerging slowly now from. It would be a dangerous miscalculation not to understand that 50 years of that repression, and that's what we've had, 50 to 60 years of it, leaves deep scars, deep absences, deep vacuums. And as I go along in this conversation, you will probably notice them, but I don't want you to feel bad about it. It's not your fault. You live in a society that is only emerging from 50 years of taboo, and you can't possibly know what no one had the courage to teach you, because it wasn't a decision based on economics or knowledge or science or anything else. It was a decision based on fear. Professors fearful for their careers, teachers fearful for their jobs, and everybody else fearful that something bad would befall them if they pursued an interest in criticism. So we have a tradition in economics, of which I'm a part too, of studying economics while reading the articles and the books of people who celebrated it at every turn. The very words in our discipline, optimality. We study optimality. That's called the best of all possible worlds. We're optimal. We have equilibrium. Indeed, we have a lot of the things you search for in your own life, only you're probably smart enough to know you're not going to find them. Economists think they found them, which is not to their credit. It's a problem. The metaphor I would use is the following. Suppose you had a family that lived up the street and you wanted to understand that family for whatever reason. And you knew there was mama and papa and 2 children. And you further knew that one of the children thought this was the greatest family the world had ever seen. Felt charmingly lovey and lucky about being born into it. And the other family thought, and the other child thought that this family was a psychological basket case. If you wanted to understand, I know nobody here has any experience of anything like this. Just think of other families that might be like that. If you wanted to understand such a family, would you talk to one child? Or would you think it was appropriate for you to talk to the child who loved the family, the child who was critical of the family, and then draw your conclusions based on the conversations you'd had? If you want to understand capitalism, friends, it's like understanding the family up the street. You can talk to the people who love it and celebrate it. Do that. That won't be hard because 99.9% of the textbooks written are written by people who love it. But you need also to talk to the folks who are critical of it. Otherwise, you won't understand anything. It's a serious problem, and as I say, we're only emerging. So keep it in your mind as I go through what I have to say to you. First, let me make the case that socialism is returning very quickly. For the last 50 years, when socialism was a taboo, we were taught in the United States that the socialism has something to do with the Soviet Union and China. Those people are scary and frightening and want to hurt us, and so we should be angry and bitter at them. And one of the ways to express our anger, disagreement, and bitterness is to know as little as possible about the theory they claim to use to make sense of the world. Whatever logic you find in that, welcome to the United States for 50 years. Meanwhile, of course, socialism existed. The American people, and the American media, and the American government, and the American academic community pretended that it wasn't there, but it always was, and it always has been. But for 50 years, you couldn't talk about it. Even the critical movements inside the United States, when they arose against nuclear testing, for peace, against racism, against sexism, and so on, were movements that were carefully cleansed of their Marxist or socialist or communist affiliations. Even when socialists and communists were leaders of them, they kept that fact quiet because it was scary for the others in those movements who wanted to be sure that whatever they were saying about those other social problems would not be compromised by being exposed as critics of capitalism. That really kept going until, I'm going to exaggerate here, but just to make the point, until the autumn of 2011, when a new movement grew up, as they always do. This one took a peculiar name, Occupy Wall Street. It was even more peculiar because it was started by a group of relatively young people who thought it was terribly daring and provocative and revolutionary to set up pup tents in a park in downtown Manhattan. But it spread like wildfire. In 3 months, there were 350 cities across the United States who saw the same behavior. And what was very powerful was, instead of hiding their criticism of capitalism, the Occupy Wall Street movement did something no other mass movement had dared to do for 50 years. They put it right in the front. They made their defining slogan 1% versus 99%. And they were so good at it that within 2 months, whoops, good catch, no? Within 2 months, the President of the United States repeated this slogan as part of his speech. They put an economic criticism of capitalism. It produces 1% with wealth and power and 99% with little of either. It didn't last very long, but that should surprise nobody. These kinds of movements erupt, and then they have to try to find their footing, and the early efforts rarely do. So here we are, barely 4 years later, and we see Chapter 2. And Chapter 2 is the Bernie Sanders phenomenon, isn't it? In which millions and millions of Americans don't care that the man has the word socialist attached to him. He can run for office. 9 months ago, a very high official of the Democratic Party had a conversation with me. And in that conversation, she said, that's a hint, she said, I can't go further than that, but some of you can take it further. She said, we're worried about Bernie Sanders. I said, really? Why? Well, we figure he's going to get 1 to 3% of the vote in the primaries. I said, and why is that worrisome? Because as she explained to me, there are a number of states where if he does that and the people who support him don't then vote for Mrs. Clinton, those states are close states and they could swing. 1 to 3% can make the difference. And the notion that Mr. Sanders would not be limited to 1 to 3% of the vote, that he wouldn't be a fringe candidate, a position candidate, a protest candidate, but would be a serious threat, never dawned on them. So deeply in touch is the Democratic Party with the sentiment of the American people that they had no clue. So socialism is coming back. It's going to come back bigger and harder than most folks expect, since most of the repression was the repression of something that didn't go away just because you pretended not to see it. So it's coming back. Let me make it personal one more step. I retired as a professor at UMass in end of 2008. And now I'm much busier than I ever was as a professor. I run around the country talking about what's wrong with capitalism. I can't possibly fulfill all the invitations. I limit myself to 3 trips a month across the United States. I'm now going to list for you where I've spoken in the last 4 months. In each case, I'm only going to list audiences that were at least 300 people. Okay, here we go. Tampa, Florida, St. Petersburg, Florida, Houston, Texas, Ames, Iowa, Seattle and Bellingham, Washington, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Berkeley, Fresno, Boston, Syracuse, and Ithaca. That's just to get you to get a feeling for the crisscrossing of the country that I now do. I'm always asked to talk about what's wrong with capitalism. This never happened before in my life. Something is fundamentally shifting in the United States. The reason I tell you all this is because you may not feel it quite here. That's nobody's fault. That's the way these things are. They develop unevenly. But you should be aware from someone like me that all of this is going on. I live in Manhattan. Once or twice a day, I am picked up by a limousine in front of my house. My neighbors think I am something very important. And I'm whisked off to a television studio somewhere where I give interviews. In that way, I can talk to millions of people. And the interviews are always about the same thing, which is, tell us about what's wrong with capitalism. Most of the time, that's what they ask me to do. Okay? I've done interviews with Bill Maher on that late night comedy show that I'm sure some of you watch. He chose, I didn't, he chose. And what he talked to me about, I did the opening monologue, lasts about 9 minutes when he interviews someone at the beginning of his program. He chose the topic Marxism. So he and I discussed Marxism for 10 million people, whatever it is that watches. The best interviews I've done in the last 2 or 3 years have been with Bill Moyers. I did 3 of those. I've also done Up with Chris Hayes. These are things that didn't used to happen in the United States, because a person who's a critic of capitalism, which I am, a person who acknowledges with appreciation all that one learns from Karl Marx, which I do. So be careful, so some of you, don't tell your parents that you came to this session because it might upset them. I hope I'm kidding. Okay, so socialism. What happened to it when it went into hibernation here in the United States? Well, it didn't go into hibernation elsewhere in the world. It's alive and kicking. There is no country on the face of the earth where there aren't socialist organizations, socialist political parties, socialist trade unions, socialist university departments, you name it. The movement spread spectacularly quickly. And the single most important theoretical structure of ideas within global socialism has been Marxism, the ideas that come from Karl Marx, which are as seminal to that critical way of thinking about capitalism as the ideas of Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Marshall, Keynes were to people who loved capitalism. And that tradition has deepened. If you have a movement like that across the globe, and let's remember, Karl Marx only died 150 years ago. That's not a long time historically. But in that time, since he died, in the end of the 19th century, his ideas have spread everywhere, into every culture on this earth. Therefore, the thoughts about Marxism, the interpretations of Marxism, the very definitions of socialism are very diverse. Socialism is a big, broad, diverse tradition of thought that's critical of capitalism, that has, if it has any motto, the motto, we can do better than capitalism. But exactly how to do better and where to focus and what to do, in what order, in what way, people disagree about all of that. Keep it in mind, because the next time you pick up an article or a book that begins with the Marxist view or the socialist view, put the book down, because you're reading an idiot. There is no the. Only a person who's either uninformed or has some other intent would write like that. You have to acknowledge that there are a variety. You have every right to pick whichever one you wish to discuss, or whichever one you wish to use, or whichever one you wish to criticize. But you can't pretend. It's as if I offered you a course in religion, and all you heard from day one to the end of it was about Baha'i. That's a religion, but to present it as though it were the whole story would indicate you're either ignorant or someone that's paying you for some reason to talk like that. So socialism is a very diverse tradition. And it always comes in with a bit of a cloud, because that's how folks deal with criticism. They don't handle it too well. Even in your own personal life, you probably noticed that when some of your friends offered you a criticism you weren't quite yet ready to hear, you didn't take it all that well. Well, that works in society too. Every economic system that has ever existed on the face of the earth, slavery, feudalism, you name them, had people who loved it and people who criticized it from the beginning. And so did capitalism. The fact that you don't know about it, didn't hear about it, no one ever took you through it, doesn't mean it wasn't there. So socialism evolved, socialism developed. Two particular ideas of socialism became dominant. They weren't the only ones. It was a historical matter that they became dominant. So let me describe them, because you'll find them familiar. Idea number one, that what socialism is when you do away with private property, private enterprises, private businesses, and you substitute government ownership and government business. It's a notion that socialism and capitalism are different in the following way. In capitalism, private individuals own and operate enterprises, whereas in socialism, the government does. That everything is about the government, and the government taking over, and the government running everything. Let me give you a piece of advice if this strikes you as familiar. You would have to search long and hard in the very voluminous works of Karl Marx to find one word about this. He wasn't interested in the government. He didn't write an article or a book about the government. It was a sideline for him. He was interested in other things. And a discussion of the difference between a private enterprise and a state enterprise, you won't find it in Marx. He wasn't interested. Had nothing to do with his project. Let's continue. The second way socialism has been defined in the 19th and 20th century was as follows. Instead of the market, instead of letting the market decide how you distribute goods and services, it's going to be done by government central planners. There's going to be people in the government who plan who gets what. Okay, so capitalism, was your markets, that's how you distribute, and socialism was planning. Okay, now we have a nice simple way of understanding it. Capitalism is private enterprise and markets, and socialism is government enterprise and government planning. And you could say that the Soviet Union and China tried in their way to get that project going by making those changes. Making revolutions. 1917 in Russia, 1949 in China, moving private enterprise into the government's hands and substituting planning for markets. That indeed was the dominant interpretation of what was at stake here. Now let me tell you a little bit about that. It didn't work out quite the way the people who made the revolutions had hoped for. Didn't it? Does that mean it's all a failure? Of course not. I assume there's some of you who might want to think that, but your smarter brain knows better. What was successful about the Soviet Union and China? Well, one of their major goals was to stop being the two, or among the two poorest countries on the face of the earth, which Russia was in 1917 and China surely was in 1949. You read anything about Russia before 1917 and you will read an unbelievably poor, illiterate, underdeveloped country, and the same is true of China. In the years after the revolution, two things happened in those two countries. They experienced a more rapid economic development and growth than any capitalist country had ever done before. It's over in Russia. It's not over in China. For those of you who keep track, in the last 20 years, the United Nations records which country grows fastest in the world. And for the last 25 years, number one on the list of all countries is the People's Republic of China. So if you wanted to make a socialist revolution to get rapid economic growth, then the Russian and Chinese way is clearly the way to go. So for those of you who need to be critical of those societies, be careful how you criticize, or else you're going to get yourself in a mess of trouble. Did they create the socialist world that was the inspiration of their leaders? No. One of the things they discovered is if you give the government the amount of power necessary to get that kind of rate of growth, and if you give the government the power necessary to substitute its own planning for the market, you're going to have a government who has so much power that you're going to have a new kind of problem, which is how that power is used everywhere else in society. And in both those societies, that didn't work out real well. So guess what? Socialists had to face something. That the definition of socialism as government enterprise and planning, as opposed to capitalism, private enterprise, and markets, wasn't adequate. And so socialists became critical of the way socialism had been interpreted. And like people who become critical of something often do, they said, gee, let's go back to the original ideas, the founding ideas, and see whether maybe along the way they were interpreted in a manner which, in retrospect, seeing what happened, we might want to change, we might want to question. Which Marxists and socialists and communists have been doing for about 25 years. And part of what I'm doing is giving you a report on where it all came out, and what's happening now, and where it's going. But before I do, let me make sure we all are on the same page. Am I saying that the experiments in building socialism undertaken in the Soviet Union, China, Eastern Europe, Vietnam, Cuba, and so on, are now being set aside in favor of an alternative? That these were experiments that taught some lessons about what you should do and some lessons about what you shouldn't do? Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. And that now new directions are taken. Yes, I'm saying that. And lest you think this is some sort of remarkable or questionable criticism, let me remind you, capitalism didn't come into the world all in one moment of perfection. There were lots of efforts to set up what we call capitalist economic systems, at various points in human history. And you know what? They had an experience exactly like the Soviet Union and China. They tried something. It worked in some ways, not in others. People were critical, gave up that way of doing it, and tried. It took many efforts before capitalism became the dominant system in the world that we see today. There were trials and errors, experiments that worked, experiments that didn't, lessons that were learned, and eventually the conditions were in place for there to be capitalism on a global scale. So to discover that the early experiments in socialism, Russia, China, and so on, weren't the final end, didn't solve all the problems, didn't work out exactly right, is something you should all have expected, rather than taken as evidence that there's something not viable about this. That would be historically weird as a conclusion, given what we know about every other system. Well then, what had the criticisms among socialists, Marxists, and communists about what happened in the Soviet Union and China? Where have they gone to? What lessons have they drawn from it? And again, we can go into this in conversation later, I hope, but let me give you the summary report. The criticism is this, that the interpretations of Marx's critique of capitalism that focused on having the state come in and take over ownership and operation of enterprises, having planning substitute for markets, that was way too, and now I'm going to use an economics term, don't get upset, way too macroeconomic, too focused on the big issues. Who owns stuff? Who shapes distribution? It didn't pay attention to the micro level. It didn't pay attention particularly to what goes on inside the enterprise. It acted as if that really didn't matter very much. So long as the government took over and ran the enterprise, and so long as government planners distributed, we'd get socialism. That what was the obstacle to socialism was the private nature of property and the market as an institution. By the way, this old idea, which socialists are now rejecting, has not been rejected, by the way, by the New York Times, for example. For the New York Times, capitalism is free markets and free enterprise, and socialism, communism is government markets and planning. They live in a definition that the people they use it for have rejected for 20 years. That's what happens if you have a repression of a discourse in a society the way we have had. They're really behind the times. Why? Because where socialists are going now is saying, wait a minute, what did Karl Marx focus on if he didn't focus on planning? There is no argument in Marx about planning. No sustained argument ever. There's no sustained argument about public versus private enterprise either. Wow, so the things that were picked up by Marxists and socialists are not things that Marx himself focused on. What did old Marx focus on, and might it give us a clue about another way to interpret socialism? The answer is, yeah, he focused someplace else, and yeah, it gives us a clue, and I'm going to tell you what it is. What Marx focuses on is the process of production, what goes on inside the enterprise, where you work, 9 to 5, 5 days a week. When you go to work, what goes on there? How do people interact there? That's what he was interested in. That's what the 3 volumes of Capital, which is what his great achievement, well, I mean, he wrote a lot of other things too, but that was his great achievement. That's what he was interested in. How does production work? And he was very critical of the capitalist way of producing, and he was clearly in favor of an alternative. Wow. That means that socialism is now going back to Marx, finding in him this discussion of the enterprise and redefining what socialism is. And I think it's worth your attention because it's going to be what socialism is for the rest of your lives. It's the socialism of the 21st century, which is different from the socialism of the 19th and 20th centuries. Here we go. The critique of Marx can best be shown, please folks, don't get worried, I am now going to do economic arithmetic. This is always a dangerous moment because there are certain folks who have been trained in a certain way, nobody's fault. If you start writing arithmetic on the board, their eyes glaze over, their brains go on vacation, and they get frightened. Don't. This is really very simple. Okay. In Marx's way of thinking, capitalism is easily represented in the following way of understanding what the process of production is. And because Marx is interested in human beings, and Marx is interested in how people relate to one another, because that's what he's concerned with, he's going to analyze what happens in production in terms of labor, of this activity people give themselves to when they go to work, and how they relate to one another as they go about transforming nature into chairs and software programs and haircuts and everything else. Okay? So we're going to start this way. Every act of production makes use of some kinds of tools, equipment, raw material, whatever. For example, let's use a chair as an example. If you're going to make a chair, you need some wood and some glue and maybe some nails and a hammer, and you get the idea. And all of those things that are used in production were made by human beings, labor, that's now available for us to use to make more things. Somebody did work a while ago to make the hammer, which I'm going to now use to make the chair. Somebody a while ago put together whatever needed to make the glue that I use and to cut the trees into the lumber that I use. And so we're going to use a simple EL, embodied labor. Every production makes use of embodied labor, labor that's embodied in some product that was done earlier that's now an input to what we're doing now. Basically, simple idea. Here comes another simple idea. With this embodied labor, labor embodied in all the tools, equipment, and raw material, production involves the addition of living labor, the worker. You, him, her, the people working. So we're going to call that living labor. Embodied labor plus living labor gives you the total labor in whatever we produce in an economy. It's real simple. Okay? You can say it in other words. There's the value of all the stuff we use up when we produce, tools, equipment, and raw materials. And then there's the value added by the worker who uses those pieces of equipment to transform the raw material into the final. So this is nails, glue, lumber. This is the chair maker's effort, and the outcome is the chair. Okay? This is very simple. What is capitalism about? By some process, which we can talk about later, the embodied labor, the work done by working people in the past, becomes the private property of a few people. You know their names. They're called employers. They didn't make this stuff. Absolutely not. Somebody else did. Workers. But those workers didn't get to keep what they produced. They lost what they produced, and it became the property of somebody else. And that capitalist brings to the production process whatever it is he owns. Let's just say, just to make it simple, that it's worth 100. It doesn't matter what it is, just 100 of anything. So we know we're using up in making chairs 100 worth of hammers, nails, glue, lumber, all of that. And now the worker adds value to what he or she produces by transforming the lumber, nails, and glue into a new finished thing called a chair or a sofa or any other piece of output. Okay, and let's, just to make it real simple, say it's another 100. And so the final chair is worth 200. I told you this would be easy. 100 plus 100 equals 200. Economists think this is an enormous achievement here, but most of you probably don't. The arithmetic is simple. Okay? Now let's follow the logic as Marx did. This is what a capitalist does. He brings 100 of what he's come to acquire somehow, we don't know how. And by the way, we never asked the capitalist quite how he got it, do we? It's really only, do you got it or do you not have it? And if you have it, you can be the employer. And if you don't, you can't. The fact that the employer who has it didn't produce it is a nagging problem we prefer not to ask. But we'll come back to it. And you know you can't be an employer because you don't have it. You didn't get it. Somebody else did. So the capitalist brings his 100. But he uses that up. That's the tools and equipment used up. So that 100 shows up in the chair as half of the 200 that chair is worth. And we know that the chair is worth 200 because in addition to the 100 of stuff used up, there was 100 more value added by the worker who worked to make the chair that's worth 200. Now, says Marx, and you're going to say it with me because you're going to understand this. Now Marx says, let's see. For the capitalist, he wants to get back what he laid out, the 100. He gave 100 to the production process. So when he sells the chair at 200, he's going to take 100 of it to replace the tools and equipment and raw materials used up in producing the chair. That's how he can keep on being a chair capitalist. That's how he can keep production going. He has to replace the tools, equipment, and raw materials he used up, doesn't he? Yeah, he does. I don't have the time to be Socratic because we don't have enough time. Okay, let's see. So out of the 200 worth of chair, you need to take 100 to replace what you used up. That leaves you with 100 after you sell the chair. What are you going to do with the 100? You could, here we go now, because this is the crucial part. You could take the other 100 and you could give it to the worker. Because after all, it was the worker whose labor added the 100 of value to this stuff to make the 200. You could, couldn't you? And the logic would be, gee, the worker added the value, he or she, here we go folks, should get it. Because he gave it. He created it. He made it happen, he should get it. Do you think that happens in capitalism? No,
Satisfied?
you don't, do you? We don't give the worker the value added. Ever
My pleasure.
in capitalism. It's not how it works. You all know that. But I'm putting it kind of right up front and bold for you to deal with. What is it that capitalists do? They divide that 100 into two parts. One part is what we pay the worker. I'll be generous and say 50. Now you get it. If you made a chair of 200 and you used 100 to replace the tools, equipment, and raw materials you used up, and you used another 50 to pay the workers, that leaves what? 50. Good. Higher math of economics. 50. And Marx called this the surplus. It's what the capitalist has left over after he pays out to himself the 100 worth of tools, equipment, and raw materials he contributed that got used up, and he pays the workers. He's got to pay the workers, because if he doesn't, they won't show up anymore, and the game is over. So to keep it going, he has to replace the tools and equipment, and he has to pay the workers. But he has to pay the workers, here we go, folks, less than the value added by the workers when they work. Or to use the technical term economists like, he has to rip the workers off. He has to steal from them part of what their labor added. You know what the lesson here is? For those of you who imagined that when you graduate from here you will get a job, in fact the only job you will accept is one that pays you what you're worth. Never gonna happen. The condition of your employment is that you produce more by your labor than you get paid. Welcome to the capitalist system. That's how it works. This thing, surplus, that's profits. That's where the profits of enterprise come from. The best way to describe your work in a capitalist enterprise is not that the employer gives you a job, it's that you give your employer the surplus. The giver and the getter are in reverse order from what the language suggests. You are doing wonderful things for your employer, and they will keep you in that job exactly as long as you can keep producing a surplus adequate to what they need. Okay? That's step one. Volume 1 of Capital lays all that out. And for those of you who have never seen this before, no one has ever done this with you before? This simple, took me 5 minutes. Now you get a taste of that repression that I talked to you about at the beginning. That's what happens in a society which is not allowed to think like this. So for some of you, maybe it's the first time. Let's continue. What does the capitalist do with the surplus? A lot of things. A lot of things. And they're very interesting and they shape the economy. In order for the capitalist to survive, he's got to take this 50 that he appropriates from the worker who produced it, and he's got to make sure it's distributed in society to keep himself in office, to keep himself in the job, to keep the capitalist system going. He has to take steps to make sure that this stuff keeps on happening. He can't, as you might imagine, take the 50 of surplus and have a wonderful evening on the town, going to an expensive restaurant and a lovely piece of theater and then a trip to the Bahamas. He wouldn't be a capitalist very long. He's got to make sure that things are taken care of in this society. Let me give you an example. It's possible that these workers, let me be more blunt, that people like you in a job might encounter a person like me in a classroom, which would mean the next day when you come to work, your attitude might have changed. You would be beginning to understand that at the end of the day of a job that you've had, when you had that funny feeling and spoke to a person right next to you on the way out of the building, you feel vaguely, I don't know, ripped off. Yes, good, you got it. There's a reason why you do. You're actually paying attention. Most people in capitalism feel that way. It doesn't show up in the language. We have to disguise it, so we do. Here's an example. At the end of the working day, on your way home, you stop somewhere before you get home. And you stop in a place where you can sit down and have a drink. And the name of this experience in our culture is called happy hour, to help you understand what the previous hours aren't. It's your happy time, because the other 8 hours, to use another technical term, suck, don't they? Don't they? The culture does recognize it. It does. It just needs a little help interpreting. So it gets distributed, this surplus. You know what it does? It's taken by capitalists and it's given to, I don't know, let's see some institutions who get distributions of the surplus. In many capitalist societies, capitalists support local churches. And why might they do that? Because in the church, something is taught that says none of what I've just described is going on. Or maybe they fund a university. Maybe they take a part of the surplus and make a beautiful building, sort of, you know, like this one. And why might they do that? Because in the university, like in the church, a completely different story is told about all of this. Let me give you an example. Here's a way to understand economics. Production is a wonderful, harmonious collaboration The worker brings his labor, the landlord brings the land, and the capitalist brings the money and the equipment and the factory. And they all cooperate to produce the output, and then they divide the revenue earned amongst each of them in proportion to the contribution each has made. You might call this fairsies. This is an economics in which everybody is fairly treated. It makes you vibrate with the harmony of it all. That's how we teach economics in the United States. I know that because for 50 years, I did that. That's what we taught, because that's what we learned. And that's no accident, because that's a completely different story from this one. In that story, everybody gets in proportion to what they contribute. Fairsies. There's no surplus, there's no ripping off, you got nobody to be angry at. If you don't have more wealth than you would like, it's your own damn fault you didn't contribute more. So how can you expect to get more? It's wonderfully comforting. It's like knowing that there's somebody up there who, despite everything else, really likes you. Even though your best friend doesn't.
Don't be shy.
Okay, it's very important. Here are some other things that have to happen. Suppose these workers, for one way or another, discover they don't like this arrangement. They might decide one day to come into work and say, you know, you're a nice boss and all that, but we're not doing this anymore. You want us to work and add value of 100, we want the 100. Because we do it, we add the value, you give us the 100. And the employer says no, and things get kind of ugly. At that point, the employer has an option. Very interesting option. He can go and pick up the phone, and he can call a place in town. And he says, you know, I'm getting scared, and very quickly something interesting happens. A truck or a van leaves an office downtown filled with people in dark blue uniforms who come right to your workplace with a big stick and beat up on these people to help them change their mind. It's called the police. And for the capitalist to do what he does and be what he is, he has to have that phone there. And there has to be a bunch of people in blue uniforms, and there has to be a van, and there has to be an office, and that all costs money. Where do you think that comes from? That's another use of the surplus. Let me pick some that aren't so confrontational with you. The capitalist also, in order to be a capitalist, he has to make sure that these 100 value added by workers, that the workers know what they're doing. He wants to be able to hire workers who know how to add and know how to read and know how to take orders. They need, in short, to go to school, to learn those things. And the capitalist knows he has to take a part of the surplus to sustain the school system. So he pays a part of the surplus in taxes to the government to run the schools, to teach the people so they can produce the value added when he hires them. The surplus has to be distributed. Marx goes through all this, by the way. All the different ways the surplus is distributed to keep this system going. And you know what it adds up to, says Marx? The way the surplus is used by the employer who gets the surplus is to keep himself in the dominant position, to keep this system going, and that's what he wants because he's the guy at the top. He's the guy who gets the surplus. He's the guy who knows how to use it in such a way as to keep himself in the dominant position, which he's been doing a good job of for 200 years or so that we've had capitalists. Done a good job. What's the implication of this for socialism? What is socialism, given what I've described here? I'm going to answer the question. You're going to see where socialism is now going way different from what it was before. Socialism now becomes this story, this surplus, but instead of the surplus going from one group of people, the workers, to another group of people, the employers, that's over. The implication of Marxist theory is that a new and different society is one that would say here, in this situation, the workers will still come to work, they'll still add 100 of value, they'll get 50 for themselves for their wages and their income, but the other 50, the surplus, they get that. They don't give that to anybody else. They take it and collectively, democratically decide what to do with the surplus they themselves produced. That's what socialism is about. That's the end of capitalism. No more capitalists. The workers who produce the surplus, as individual effort outputters, you might say, then collectively and democratically decide what to do with the surplus they have produced. They become, to use a language that as an American you might find easier, they become their own boss, don't they? In the only way that's actually available to them, to become their own boss in a collective way. What is the simple American phrase that captures this? Worker co-op. It's very old. You don't even need Marxism either. All that Marxism does is provide us with the logic and a roadmap back to capture what it was that made people all through history decide that working cooperatively, producing a worker co-op, is an attractive way to organize work, is an attractive institution to pursue. That's why you have examples of it thousands of years ago, hundreds of years ago, and right now. But it's going to take off now because it isn't an idiosyncratic, odd, leftover from an earlier period. It is a new direction. So let me conclude with spelling out for you what I've just told you. Socialism, having changed dramatically, is basically saying that what went wrong in the Soviet Union and China was that they never transformed the workplaces. They never created democratic decisions. What they did is substitute private owners of businesses and put in government officials. For the average worker, it didn't mean all that much. They didn't have the workers make the decisions collectively what to do with the surplus they produced. They didn't do that. They substituted planning for markets, they substituted public for private ownership, but they didn't change the micro-level organization. Another way to say it, the co-op represents, like the critique of capitalism here represents, an appeal for the democratization of enterprises, to bring democracy to the workplace. Now, think with me in the final 5 minutes that I take. Think with me what I am saying. You live in a society that makes a fetish out of claiming that it is a democracy. If democracy means anything, it means that if you're affected by a decision, you have the right to participate in making it. That's why we vote for the mayor, because the mayor of our town makes decisions that affect us. We have to have influence. Okay, if you believe in democracy, then the first place it should have been instituted is at the workplace. Why? Because that's where you spend most of your adult life. 5 out of 7 days, when you're an adult, you're at work. And for many of the other hours, you're either recuperating from, happy hour, or getting ready for work. If you believe in democracy, then the workplace would have been the first place you would have instituted it. But you live in a society, the United States of America, which has never had democracy in the workplace. You go to work in a corporation today, there's a group of people, the board of directors, 15. They make all the decisions. What you produce, how you produce, where you produce, and what gets done with the profits you help to produce. You know what your influence is on those decisions? Zilch, nothing. There is no democracy in the workplace. You live in a country that is fighting wars halfway around the world to bring to those countries a democracy we don't have. You wonder why they're critical of us. Are you kidding? You must be kidding. Democratize the enterprise. That means a worker co-op, a democratic way to decide what is done with the surplus that everybody helps to produce. Would it make a difference? Oh boy, would it make a difference. Let's give some examples to end. Suppose over the last 40 years, when this country has been torn apart, as we're seeing in the presidential race and everything else in this country right now. Over the last 40 years, this country has been torn apart by, among other things, the exodus of large numbers of companies that left the United States, continue to leave the United States, because they can hire people for much less money over there, particularly in Asia, but not just there. Detroit went from a city in 1970 of 2 million people, the showcase of capitalism in America, to a disaster today. The population of Detroit today is 700,000 people. The majority of people driven out of their homes, their jobs, their churches, and their schools. It's a collapsed city. You should, if you've not visited, visit Detroit. Nothing I say will teach you as well as 2 hours driving through. Now, suppose a decision where you locate production was not made by a board of directors looking to make more money, but by a democratic decision of all the workers working there. You think they would have canceled out their jobs? You think they would have moved the factory, destroyed their community? Never happened. The history of this country would have been radically different. Here's another example. At the end of each year, when the company looks at its profits, all the surplus it's gotten out of its workers, who decides what to do with the profits? It's a wonderful moment for those of you who've never been that place. Imagine yourself for a moment in the Christmas party at the end of the year. Your three-quarters drunk CEO gets up on a wobbly table and makes in slurred speech, "Thank you, all of you, for having worked so hard to make this a successful year," and then he falls off the chair. Okay? The next morning, that drunk CEO will get together with his other CEOs, or whatever O's they are, and they will decide what to do with the profit. He will have thanked you for producing it, but participate in the decisions? Oh no. And if that decision means closing the factory, you lose your job? Tough. If it means using a new technology that pollutes the air that your children breathe? Tough. You don't participate. You are excluded. And you know, this comes as a surprise to many of you. Over the last 40 years, as these companies have made really big profits off of your labor, and they sit around the board of directors and the major shareholders, by the way, 20, 30 people usually, and they decide what to do with it, here comes a shock. They've decided to distribute a large part of it to themselves. What a shocker. In very high wages and dividends which go to the shareholders, which is what they are. That's why we have a growing inequality of income in this country. There's no mystery here. This has got nothing to do with education or technology. Stop! This is because we allow a tiny group of people at the top to decide what to do with the surplus we all help to produce, and they give a disproportionate amount to themselves. So we have, on the one hand, the richest people imaginable, and on the other hand, the first generation of American college students who can't get a degree without going into tens of thousands of dollars in debt. You are being ripped off here. And that's what Marxism and socialism have always had as their first thought. Appeal to the people who are the victims of capitalism, so that they begin to understand that you can do better than this system. And a worker co-op starts at the bottom and represents a new direction for socialism. That's why in Bernie Sanders' economic platform, he's a little bit about co-ops. Not a lot, but he's getting it. It's getting there. You want an example of a politician today who's gotten much further? Jeremy Corbyn, Great Britain, the leader of the Labour Party. They have the most, interesting for those of you who follow politics, the most developed understanding of the need to develop a socialist co-op sector separate from and in competition with capitalism is emerging in Great Britain under the leadership of the Labour Party under its new leader, Jeremy Corbyn, with concrete policy proposals, which, if you're interested, I'll lay out for you when we're done. Socialism is emerging now with a new direction and a new definition. And not the least interesting thing for you to watch in the years ahead in your lifetimes will be the success of this, partly because the entire anti-socialist apparatus is completely focused on what socialism isn't anymore. and completely unprepared to cope with what socialism is now becoming. That's one of the not so good results of a repression of your counter ideology for 50 years. Let me stop there. Thank you very much for your attention. Anybody who has comments, questions, don't hesitate. Everybody can't speak at once. Somebody has to have the courage to start. Good, shoot. Well, let me ask you a question. Have you seen a huge upsurge over history of working people who have become capitalists? Do you see a lot of that around you? No. And why might that be? Look at this story I told you. Remember I began at the beginning, I said to you carefully, we're not going to ask how it came to be that the work done in the past to produce the glue and the hammer and the lumber ended up being the property of a particular person. But now you do know, don't you? Because this surplus is how that happens. Surplus is part of the output that people produce that they don't get back. It goes into the hands of a person who doesn't produce anything. That's how they accumulate the wealth. The joke is when a capitalist says, hey, I deserve something because I contributed this. The answer of the worker is, you thief. You took that from us. And now you want us to allow you to do it again because we were successful in doing it the first time. Hello? There's something wrong in this story. That's what this system is. It means the mass of people produce and a tiny number of people get. Let me give you one example, which ought to really settle this once and for all. The most famous institution in the world that tracks the financial and economic inequalities in the world is a British charity, it's been around a long time, called Oxfam. I'm sure many of you know about it. And you can just go Google OXFAM, and all of its reports will be available to you, easily accessible. And once a year, they do a study of inequality in the world, and they release it usually in February. And so they did again this year. And let me give you just one of the lovely statistics that came out of it. As of the end of 2015, so it's really fresh numbers, the 62, that's, I believe, less people that are in this room right now, the 62 richest people on this earth, most of whom are American, but not all, not at all, but most are American. The 62 richest people together, according to Oxfam, have more wealth, that is, together they own more wealth than the bottom half of the population of this planet. That means 3.5 billion, with a B, billion people. I rest my case. Case is over. We have a system, capitalism, been around for 300 years, came in from the French Revolution where it promised liberty, equality, and fraternité, brotherhood. And what do we got? We got something for which the model is the ancient pharaohs of Egypt.
Ready to leave? Are you
What?
sure?
Let me remind you, the bottom half, 3.5 billion people, those are the people who die long before they need to, who don't get the medical care that we know how to deliver to them, who live in housing that's unspeakable, with unsanitary water, whose children die in crazy numbers before they reach the first year of their age. And we have a system in which 62 people have more wealth than what could ameliorate the living conditions of 3.5 billion people. Which of you has an ethical, moral, or religious commitment to values of such a system? You preserve capitalism? Why? It rips you off. For those of you, by the way, I noticed a couple of you reacting when I mentioned the debts to go through college. Even in capitalism, you don't need to do that. You don't just live in capitalism here in the United States. You live in a virulent form of it. In Germany, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden, at least those that I know of, they have over the last few years reduced the tuition in colleges to 0. Do you understand that? In Germany, it's not only 0 for Germans. Any of you can move to Germany as an American citizen or any other citizen, and you can get free tuition too. You live in a country that has gone the other way. The other way. You now get to spend more money than you used to and rack up debts you never had to before. What? The mystery isn't that this is happening to you. I've tried to explain that. The mystery is that you tolerate it. Not only do you tolerate it, but it's almost like you're being kicked. And in response to the kick, you turn the other way so the next kick can get you someplace else. What? Unless you have very unusual tastes, this is not a good idea. Not a good idea. 62 people have more wealth than 3.5 billion. You want that system? That's and you all convinced you're going to be one of the 62? Don't hold your breath. Don't hold your breath. And let me ask you another question, if I can. Suppose you make it. How enjoyable is that? How do you enjoy the dinner at one end of the table, rich as it is, if at the other end there's a baby crying of hunger? Does something to your enjoyment, doesn't it? And then again, you can pretend the baby isn't there. And we are specialists in that. Shoot. That's right. Right, and a few years earlier it was 134. They've been showing the number goes down. I've never been good at predicting. For me, predicting what's going to happen in the future is something you do at the amusement park because it's amusing. You know, when you give a person some money and they tell you who you're going to be sleeping with next week, you giggle and you laugh. If you actually begin to worry that you didn't want to sleep with that person next week, then you're not getting the point of all of this. You know, prediction is not a game. So I don't know what's going to happen. I have no idea. I do know, and this may be of interest to you, that there are all kinds of people that are worried about what's going on. I am hardly the only one, nor are socialists the only one who see it and worry about it. Warren Buffett, who is light years from a socialist, is worried about it. He's been making interesting statements for years now. You remember, some of you noticed he made a big deal out of the fact that the rate of taxation he pays is lower than his secretary pays, you know, who makes the secretary's income. And he's very worried. And there are all kinds of statements being made by all kinds of people at the tippity top of this society who are very worried that this is a society, that this is an economic system, capitalism, that is killing the goose that laid its golden eggs. It is developing its own opposition. Come on, folks, you're watching it. That's what Mr. Trump represents in his way, and Mr. Sanders in his way. And they're doing really well. They're getting millions and millions of people who, despite a relentless barrage from the press, basically portraying both of them as crazy or outside the pale, etc., doesn't work the way it once did. Doesn't convince half or more of the people the way it once kind of did. You're watching the dissolution of this system. That's why I told you about me personally. I'm running around the country giving talks like this everywhere. I'm on radio and television doing it everywhere. I started my little radio program in New York City in March of 2011. We are now 5 years later. I'm on 52 stations across the United States. What's going on? Suddenly, the critique of our economic system has an audience I've never seen before. I live in Manhattan. Because I went to those elite universities, I have friends who are right-wing economists and left-wing economists and economists in the middle. We do not agree on how we got into this mess, and we do not agree on how we got out. But here's something we all agree on, which surprises us, that this is the worst condition of the American economy in our lifetimes. For those of you that are young, that's not good news. Not about your job, not about your income, not about your future. I do want to make one plug, if you allow me, actually two. One, if you're interested in the Marxian theory, if you would like to acquaint yourself with this, one of the books I wrote with a good colleague of mine that Tom, I believe, also studied with, Steve Resnick, was recently published, which also is a sign of change in the United States. I've published a bunch of books in economics. Each time I published a book, I wrote it, and either by myself or with whoever else I wrote it, I went and asked publishers if they might be interested. The last book I wrote, this one, was a completely new situation for me. 4 publishers competed with one another to get us to go with them. A very pleasant change, I assure you.